January 7, 1942. The waters off the Caroline Islands. The ocean is silent except for the slow creak of wood and the rhythmic slap of waves against a damaged hull. Commander Toshikazu Omae stands on the bridge of the destroyer Hamikaze, his binoculars trained on the horizon where the sun bleeds into the Pacific. Around him, the wreckage of what was once an American supply convoy drifts in lazy circles, crates, lifeboats, oil slicks that shimmer like broken rainbows. His men cheer from the deck below, their voices carrying across the water, young and triumphant. In his hand, Omae holds a torn American flag plucked from the debris. The fabric is coarse, soaked with salt water, already beginning to fade. He folds it carefully, methodically, as if the act itself is a ritual of conquest. In this moment, standing above the spoils of war, he believes what every officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy has been taught to believe, that America, soft and distant, cannot sustain a war across an ocean this vast, that the destruction of their fleets will break their will, that time is Japan's greatest ally. He does not yet know that time is already running out. Within 6 weeks, the name of a place he has never heard of, a shallow harbor in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor, will become synonymous with a miscalculation so profound it will haunt Japanese war planners for generations. Within 6 months, American shipyards will begin launching vessels at a pace that defies every assumption, every strategic calculation, every pre-war intelligence estimate. Within a year, the very concept of naval superiority will be rewritten not by tactics or courage, but by the cold, relentless mathematics of industrial production. The flag in Omae's hand, this symbol of a conquered enemy, will become a ghost. And the ocean that seems so empty now, so conquered, will fill with steel. But on this January morning, beneath a sky streaked with the smoke of burning oil, none of this is yet visible. To understand the shock that would soon paralyze the Imperial Japanese naval staff, one must first understand the bedrock assumptions upon which their entire war strategy was built. Japan in 1942 was not a nation stumbling blindly into conflict. It was a calculated gambler, a power that had spent decades studying its potential adversaries, measuring their strengths, probing their weaknesses. The architects of Japanese naval doctrine, men like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Admiral Osami Nagano, and Captain Tamichi Hara, were not fools. They were professionals, many educated in the West, fluent in English, veterans of the First World War. They had walked the decks of American battleships as observers. They had toured American factories. They had read American newspapers. They knew the United States possessed vast resources, a population nearly twice that of Japan, and an economy that dwarfed their own. And yet, they chose war. The logic was brutal but coherent. Japan's strategists believed that America's greatest strength, its sprawling industrial capacity, was also its greatest vulnerability. Distance. The United States was separated from the Pacific theater by 6,000 miles of ocean. Its shipyards were concentrated on 2 coasts, its supply lines stretched thin, its political will untested by true sacrifice. The Japanese war plan, refined over years of tabletop exercises and fleet maneuvers, rested on a simple premise: strike fast, strike hard, and force a negotiated peace before American industry could fully mobilize. Destroy the Pacific Fleet at anchor. Seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, fortify a defensive perimeter so vast and costly to assault that American public opinion would demand a settlement. The war would be won not in years, but in months. Not by attrition, but by shock. In the Imperial Naval Staff's pre-war estimates, American shipbuilding capacity was acknowledged but dismissed as irrelevant. Yes, the United States could build ships, but not quickly enough, not in time to matter. Japanese intelligence reports from the late 1930s noted that American naval construction followed a peacetime rhythm, slow and bureaucratic, constrained by budget negotiations and labor disputes. A single fleet carrier took 3 to 4 years to complete. A battleship, even longer. Japan, by contrast, had been on a war footing for a decade, its economy reorganized around military production, its shipyards running at maximum capacity. The Imperial Navy entered the war with 10 aircraft carriers, including the most advanced in the world. The Americans had 7, scattered across 2 oceans. The math seemed simple. What the Japanese planners failed to grasp, what their pre-war intelligence could not capture, was the fundamental nature of American industrial culture. They saw factories, they counted ships, but they did not understand the system. They did not understand that American shipbuilding was not merely a matter of assembling steel, but of mobilizing an entire continental economy, of transforming civilian infrastructure into a war machine with a speed and flexibility that had no historical precedent. They did not understand that the same country that had built the Hoover Dam in 5 years, that had electrified an entire rural hinterland, that had turned automobile production into a science, could apply those same principles to the construction of warships. They did not understand that the peacetime slowness they had observed was not a structural limitation, but a choice. And so, when Commander Omai stood on his bridge in January 1942, surveying the wreckage of an American convoy, he believed he was witnessing the beginning of the end. The Imperial Navy had sunk 4 American carriers in the opening months of the war. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. The supply lines to Australia and the Philippines were under siege. Every report confirmed what doctrine had predicted. The Americans were reeling, defensive, unable to project power. Tokyo celebrated. The emperor's forces controlled an empire stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, the largest expanse of conquered territory since the Mongols. In the officers' mess halls of Japanese warships, sake flowed freely, and toasts were raised to the inevitable victory. But in the spring of 1942, something began to change. It was subtle at first, an anomaly in reconnaissance reports, a discrepancy in expected American strength. Then it became undeniable. Ships that had been sunk were reappearing. The Japanese military attaché in neutral Switzerland, Lieutenant Colonel Takeo Mori, was the first to sound the alarm. In April 1942, he submitted a classified intelligence report to Tokyo based on intercepted American radio traffic and shipping manifests obtained through covert channels. The report, buried in the archives of the Japanese Defense Ministry and declassified decades later, contained a single line that should have shattered every assumption of the Imperial Naval Staff. American shipyard output appears to have increased by a factor of 5 since December. Verify immediately. Verify they did, but verification brought no comfort. By May 1942, American shipyards were launching vessels at a pace that seemed, to Japanese analysts, statistically impossible. The Richmond Shipyards in California, a facility that had produced 0 warships in 1940, was now completing a Liberty cargo ship every 45 days. The Kaiser Shipyards in Portland, using a revolutionary construction method called modular assembly, had reduced the time to build an escort carrier from 14 months to 90 days. The Brooklyn Navy Yard, operating on 3 shifts around the clock, was producing destroyers so quickly that Japanese intelligence officers suspected the reports were disinformation, a psychological operation designed to demoralize their forces. But it was not disinformation. It was Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate who had never built a ship in his life before the war, applying the logic of mass production to naval architecture. It was Andrew Higgins, a boat builder from New Orleans, designing and mass-producing landing craft on an assembly line. It was the women of the swing shift, welders and riveters, many of whom had never held industrial tools before 1941, working under floodlights in shipyards that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was the transformation of the American economy into what President Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy, a phrase that Japanese planners had dismissed as rhetoric, but which was now becoming the most dangerous reality they had ever faced. The numbers were staggering. In 1941, American shipyards had launched a total of 504,000 tons of naval vessels. In 1942, that figure rose to 1-2 million tons. In 1943, it would reach 7 million tons. By 1944, American shipyards were producing more tonnage in a single month than Japan had produced in the entire year of 1941. The very concept of attrition warfare, the foundation of Japanese defensive strategy, was collapsing. For every Japanese submarine that sank an American destroyer, 2 more destroyers were already sliding down the slipways. For every carrier lost in battle, 3 more were under construction. The ocean, which had seemed so vast and protective, was filling with steel faster than Japanese forces could sink it. And the Japanese commanders, trained in the traditions of Bushido and the belief that spirit could overcome material, found themselves confronting a truth that their culture had not prepared them for: that wars between industrial powers are not won by courage or tactics alone, but by the cold arithmetic of production capacity. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Japanese naval officers were not accustomed to despair. They were men who had endured years of brutal training, who had been taught that death in battle was the highest honor, who had studied the great naval victories of history and believed themselves the inheritors of that tradition. But by late 1943, something had broken. In the private diaries and letters of Japanese commanders, documents that would only come to light after the war, a recurring theme emerges: disbelief. Not at American skill or bravery, but at the sheer, suffocating volume of materiel. Captain Tamaichi Hara, commander of the destroyer Shigure, and one of the few Japanese surface ship commanders to survive the entire war, wrote in his memoir, "We had been told that American morale was weak, that they would tire of the war, that their industrial capacity, while large, was fundamentally inefficient. But what we encountered in 1943 was something beyond industry. It was as if the entire American continent had been converted into a single factory, churning out ships, planes, and ammunition with a rhythm that felt almost supernatural. We sank their carriers, and they built more. We destroyed their supply convoys, and larger convoys appeared. It was not war as we understood it. It was something closer to being slowly buried alive." This was not poetic exaggeration. It was the testimony of a man who had watched his navy disintegrate, not through defeat in battle, but through the simple, relentless reality that his enemy could replace losses faster than he could inflict them. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 is often cited as the turning point of the Pacific War, and rightly so. It was the moment when Japanese naval superiority was shattered in a single day of catastrophic carrier losses. But Midway was only the beginning. What followed was something more insidious, more demoralizing: the slow realization that even a Japanese victory would change nothing. By the end of 1942, the United States had replaced all 4 carriers lost at Midway and added 5 more to the fleet. By mid-1943, a new fleet carrier was being commissioned every 6 weeks. Japanese shipyards, meanwhile, struggled to repair damaged vessels, hampered by shortages of raw materials, outdated construction techniques, and the constant attrition of air raids. The symbolic weight of this disparity was crushing. In Japanese military culture, the concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, was held as a counterweight to material disadvantage. Samurai warriors had defeated Mongol invasions not through superior numbers, but through discipline, sacrifice, and divine wind. The same spirit, it was believed, would carry Japan to victory against the materialistic West. But what spirit could counter an enemy that could rebuild an entire fleet in the time it took Japan to repair a single battleship? By 1944, Japanese war planners had abandoned all pretense of victory. The goal now was survival. To inflict enough casualties, to hold enough territory, to make the cost of conquest so unbearable that the Americans would agree to a negotiated peace that preserved the emperor and some measure of Japanese sovereignty. But even this modest hope was slipping away, drowned in the flood of American steel. There was a ship, or rather a type of ship, that came to symbolize this industrial chasm more than any other: the Essex-class aircraft carrier. To a Japanese destroyer captain in 1944, the appearance of an Essex-class carrier on the horizon was not merely a tactical problem. It was a message. These carriers were enormous, 27,000 tons, over 800 feet long, capable of launching 90 aircraft. They were faster than their predecessors, better armored, equipped with the latest radar and fire control systems. But what made them truly terrifying was not their capabilities. It was their number. The United States laid down 24 Essex-class carriers between 1941 and 1945. 17 of them were completed and saw combat. They bore names like Essex, Lexington, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, names of ships that Japan had already sunk, now returned as if resurrected, sailing under the same flags, carrying the same spirit, but backed by an industrial engine that seemed infinite. To sink one was meaningless. 2 more would replace it. Japanese pilots, briefed before kamikaze missions, were told that their sacrifice would cripple the American fleet. But within weeks, the same fleet would return, larger than before, the damaged carriers replaced, the losses absorbed without visible strain. This was the nightmarish logic of American production. It was not just fast, it was redundant, layered, resilient. A single torpedo hit that would cripple a Japanese carrier for months could be repaired on an American carrier in days, sometimes at sea, by damage control teams equipped with prefabricated parts manufactured in anticipation of battle damage. Japanese submariners reported sinking American supply ships in the thousands, only to see the convoys grow larger. American factories were producing not just for replacement, but for surplus building ships that would never see combat, simply because the production lines were running and the raw materials were available. And it was not only ships, it was everything. The logistics were almost incomprehensible. For every combat ship the United States launched, it launched 3 support vessels: oilers, ammunition ships, repair tenders, hospital ships, cargo freighters. The American fleet was not a navy in the traditional sense. It was a floating industrial ecosystem, capable of sustaining operations thousands of miles from home for months at a time without returning to port. Japanese forces, by contrast, were tethered to their bases, dependent on fragile supply lines that American submarines cut with increasing impunity. By 1945, the disparity had reached absurd proportions. The United States had over 1,200 major warships in commission. Japan had fewer than 200, most of them damaged or obsolete. American carrier task forces operated with impunity off the Japanese coast, launching airstrikes at will, while the remnants of the Imperial Navy hid in port, unable to sortie for lack of fuel. The once proud combined fleet, which had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating precision, was reduced to scrap metal and desperation. And yet, the most haunting aspect of this story is not the scale of American production, but the speed at which it was achieved. In December 1941, the United States was not a military superpower. It was a country still emerging from the Great Depression, with an army smaller than Portugal's and a navy spread thin across 2 oceans. Its factories were producing cars, refrigerators, radios, consumer goods, not weapons. Its workforce was civilian, its industrial infrastructure geared toward peacetime commerce. Japan, by contrast, had been on a war footing since 1931, its economy militarized, its factories optimized for weapons production, its workforce drilled and disciplined. And yet, within 18 months, the United States had not only caught up, but surpassed Japan in every measurable category of military production. Within 3 years, it was outproducing the entire Axis combined, Germany, Japan, and Italy, by a factor of 2 to 1. How is this possible? The answer lies in a convergence of factors that Japan's pre-war planners had either underestimated or failed to consider at all. First, raw materials. The United States possessed vast reserves of iron, coal, oil, and aluminum resources that Japan had to import at great cost and risk. Second, labor. The American workforce was not only larger but more flexible, capable of rapid retraining and mobilization. Women entered the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling roles that had been exclusively male. Third, technology. American industry was already the most advanced in the world, with decades of experience in mass production techniques pioneered by Henry Ford and others. Applying these techniques to shipbuilding was a conceptual leap, but not a structural impossibility. But perhaps the most critical factor was something less tangible, a culture of innovation and problem-solving that thrived under pressure. American engineers were encouraged to experiment, to improvise, to discard traditional methods if a better one could be found. The modular construction techniques that revolutionized shipbuilding, pre-assembling entire sections of a ship on land and then welding them together in the dry dock, were not invented by naval architects. They were adapted from construction practices developed for building skyscrapers and bridges. The assembly line methods that produced Liberty ships in weeks rather than years were borrowed from automobile manufacturing. Japanese industry, by contrast, was bound by tradition and hierarchy. Shipbuilding was a craft, passed down through generations of master builders, each vessel a unique creation. The idea of treating a warship like a Model T Ford as a standardized product to be manufactured on an assembly line was culturally alien. Japanese shipyards were capable of extraordinary craftsmanship, producing individual vessels of exceptional quality. But they could not scale, they could not adapt, they could not keep pace. And so, the war became a race that Japan was always destined to lose. There is a photograph, grainy and faded, taken at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California in September 1942. It shows the launch of the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel. In the background, women in welding masks stand beside men in overalls, their faces streaked with grease and sweat. The ship itself is unremarkable, a boxy, utilitarian design built for cargo, not glory. But the plaque beside the photograph notes a single staggering fact: the Robert E. C. Peary was completed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes, from the moment the keel was laid to the moment it slid into the water. 4 days. In Japan, the construction of a comparable cargo vessel took 6 months. This photograph, more than any battle report or casualty list, encapsulates the existential crisis that consumed the Japanese naval staff by 1943. It was not that they were losing battles. Battles could be won or lost, tactics adjusted, strategies revised. It was that they were confronting an enemy for whom the very concept of scarcity seemed not to apply. An enemy that could lose 1,000 ships and build 2,000 more. An enemy that could absorb catastrophic defeats and return stronger. An enemy whose wealth was not just material, but systemic. A wealth of infrastructure, education, innovation, and sheer human capital that no amount of Japanese courage or sacrifice could overcome. In his post-war interrogation by American intelligence officers, Admiral Soimu Toyoda, the last commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was asked when he first realized that Japan could not win the war. His answer was blunt. "When I saw the intelligence reports on American shipbuilding in late 1942, we had sunk 4 of their carriers, and they had already replaced them and built more. I knew then that we were not fighting a navy, we were fighting a continent." But even as the strategic situation became hopeless, the psychological dissonance persisted. Japanese commanders continued to fight with ferocity, continued to believe, or at least to profess belief, that spirit and sacrifice could still turn the tide. Kamikaze attacks intensified, not because they were effective, but because they were the only weapon left that could not be immediately replaced. A plane could be shot down, but the pilot's death had a permanence that the endless American replacements did not. It was a logic born of desperation, a last attempt to impose a human cost that industrial production could not absorb. But even here, the Americans adapted. By 1945, radar-guided anti-aircraft fire and combat air patrols had made kamikaze attacks a near-suicidal venture with diminishing returns. For every American ship sunk, a dozen kamikazes were shot down. The exchange rate was brutal, unsustainable, a final confirmation that the mathematics of the war had always been against Japan. And yet, there were moments, brief, fleeting, when individual Japanese commanders glimpsed a larger truth about what they were fighting, not just an enemy navy, but a vision of modernity itself. Commander Haruki Iki, a submarine officer who survived the war, wrote in a letter to his wife in early 1945, "We are told that the Americans are weak, that they are spoiled by luxury. that they lack the discipline of our men. But I have seen their ships, and I have seen their faces, and what I see is not weakness. It is a different kind of strength. They do not fight because they must, but because they believe they should. Their ships are not just metal, they are a statement. A statement that their way of life, their messy democracy, their noisy factories, their undisciplined freedoms can produce more, faster, and better than our order and our sacrifice. And I fear that statement may be true. This letter, discovered in the post-war archives, was never sent. It was found in Iki's personal effects after he was killed in action in the final months of the war. But its message lingered, a ghost of recognition, an acknowledgement that the war had been lost not on the battlefield, but in the foundries and shipyards of a nation that Japan had never truly understood. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the scale of the disparity was beyond comprehension. The United States had produced over 5,000 major warships during the conflict. Japan had produced fewer than 700. American shipyards had launched more tonnage in 1944 alone than Japan had produced in the entire war. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had once been the third largest in the world, was reduced to a handful of rusting hulks, most sunk in their own harbors by American air raids. And the flag that Commander Omai had held on that January morning in 1942, the torn, saltwater-soaked symbol of a conquered enemy, had become an ensign flying over hundreds of warships, sailing freely across every ocean, unchallenged. The lesson, brutal and inescapable, was this: in modern industrial warfare, production capacity is destiny. Courage, discipline, and tactical brilliance matter, but they cannot overcome a fundamental imbalance in the ability to produce, sustain, and replace the tools of war. Japan had bet on spirit, America had bet on steel, and steel, in the end, proved the stronger faith. In the years after the war, Japanese military historians struggled to make sense of the defeat. How had a nation with such pride, such discipline, such a warrior tradition been so thoroughly overwhelmed? The answers were varied. Failures of intelligence, strategic miscalculation, the decision to attack Pearl Harbor in the first place. But beneath all these explanations lay a simpler, more uncomfortable truth. Japan had never understood the nature of the enemy it was facing. They had seen America as a collection of factories and resources, as a sleeping giant that, once awakened, would fight with the same logic and limitations as every other great power in history. They had assumed that distance and supply lines would constrain American power, that industrial capacity, however vast, could not bridge an ocean. They had believed that the war would be decided in months, not years, and that their early victories would force a negotiated peace. But America was not like other great powers. It was not constrained by the old logics of empire and scarcity. It was a nation built on the idea that abundance was not just possible but inevitable, that problems were to be solved not through sacrifice but through innovation, that the application of resources and ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. The same spirit that had settled a continent, that had connected an entire nation by rail and wire, that had turned a frontier into the world's largest economy, was the spirit that turned shipyards into assembly lines and civilians into welders. And that spirit, more than any weapon, was what Japan had truly underestimated. There is a place, a small memorial, on the grounds of the Etajima Naval Academy near Hiroshima, where young officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy once trained. It is a simple stone monument inscribed with the names of ships lost in the war. Thousands of names, destroyers, cruisers, carriers, submarines, each name a story, each story an ending. But among the names, one is missing, the name of the enemy that sank them. It is not necessary. Every officer who passes that memorial knows the answer. It was not a navy. It was not even a nation in the traditional sense. It was an idea expressed in steel, an idea that freedom, for all its chaos and inefficiency, could mobilize resources and human potential on a scale that no authoritarian regime, no matter how disciplined, could match. Commander Omei survived the war. He returned to Japan in 1946, a defeated man in a defeated nation, and spent the rest of his life working as a maritime historian. In his final published work, A Reflection on the Pacific War, written in 1979, he returned to that January morning in 1942, to the moment he had stood on the deck of the Hamikaze and held an American flag in his hands. "I thought I was holding the symbol of a defeated enemy," he wrote, "but I was wrong. I was holding the future." And the future, it turned out, was built in shipyards that never slept by workers who believed in a cause larger than empire, on a scale that no one, least of all the commanders of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had ever imagined possible.